My sister assumed she could live in my house forever without paying. So I made sure she understood reality very quickly. They say that home is where the heart is, but as I've learned over my 70 years on this earth, for some people, home is merely a trophy to be polished. Or worse, a piece of meat to be sold to the highest bidder. Have you ever felt like a stranger in a place where your own footsteps used to echo with joy? Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own flesh and blood and seen nothing but a cold, calculating stranger looking back? Well, settle in. My friends, I want to tell you a story about a house, a sister's greed, and the silent strength of a woman who knew that the loudest person in the room is often the one with the least to say. This is a story for those of us who remember when a person's word was their bond and when dignity wasn't something you could buy at a designer boutique. The morning I decided to return to Oak Manor, the English sky was a bruised shade of violet, heavy with the promise of a typical British downpour. I was driving my old 2004 Volvo, a car that has more stories than most modern novels, and a heater that hums like an old friend. My clothes were just as seasoned, a waxed Barbour jacket that had seen 20 winters, a pair of sensible wool trousers, and boots that had walked through more mud than a farmer's tractor. To any passerby on the narrow lanes of the Cotswolds, I was just another elderly woman, perhaps a retired librarian or a grandmother on her way to eat to the market. And that suited me just fine. In a world obsessed with the new, there is a certain power in being invisible. As I rounded the final bend of the driveway, the manor came into view. It sat on the hill like a sleeping giant of limestone and ivy, a house that had been in my family for 4 generations. But as I drew closer, the silence I expected was replaced by the thumping bass of modern pop music and the sight of dozens of sleek, white marquees dotted across the south lawn. Valets in crisp uniforms were directing Ferraris and Lamborghinis onto the grass, the very grass my father used to obsess over. It looked less like the home I grew up in and more like a high-end car dealership or a flashy music video. My heart sank. I knew Beatrice liked to entertain, but this felt like a desecration. I pulled my dusty Volvo up to the main gate, only to be stopped by a young man with a headset and a clipboard who looked at my car as if it were a heap of scrap metal. Delivery entrance is half a mile back. Love, he said, not even bothering to look me in the eye. I rolled down the window, the damp air hitting my face. I'm not a delivery, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. I am Eleanor. I live here. The young man actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that grated on my nerves. Sure you do, and I'm the Duke of Westminster. This is a private event for Mrs. Beatrice's Global Influencer Summit. No uninvited guests. Especially not. Well, you know, he gestured vaguely at my car. I didn't argue. I've lived long enough to know that you don't fight with the gatekeeper when you own the keys to the castle. I simply pulled to the side of the road, parked on the verge, and decided to walk in through the pedestrian gate near the woods. A gate Beatrice probably didn't even know existed. As I walked, I passed the rows of guests. They were young, mostly in their 20s and 30s, dressed in clothes that looked expensive but uncomfortable, holding their phones up as if the world didn't exist unless it was framed in a digital rectangle. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were a smudge on a lens. One young woman, draped in faux fur despite the humidity, whispered to her friend, "Is that a local villager? Do they just let them wander in?" I reached the edge of the terrace just as my sister, Beatrice, was holding court. She was 10 years younger than me, but through the miracles of modern chemistry and very tight skin, she looked like she was trying to be 20 again. She was wearing a dress that must have cost more than my first house, a shimmering, gold sequined affair that caught the light with every dramatic gesture of her champagne glass. She was surrounded by a circle of admirers, telling a story about her vision for the estate. "It's about breathing life into these old bones," she cried, her voice carrying across the lawn. This house was stagnant, rotting away with old memories. I'm making it relevant again. When she finally spotted me standing at the edge of the crowd, her expression didn't soften with sisterly affection. Instead, her eyes narrowed, and a look of pure embarrassment crossed her face. She whispered something to the tall, slick-haired man beside her, her business manager, no doubt, and marched toward me. The crowd went silent. Sensing a confrontation, it was exactly what Beatrice loved, a stage. "Eleanor," she hissed, loud enough for the front row to hear, "what on earth are you doing here? And in those rags? I told you I was busy this weekend. I sent you a check for a hotel in the village. Didn't you get the message?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the frantic insecurity behind the gold sequins. The village hotel was full. "Beatrice," I replied, my voice calm and projecting clearly. "And besides, why would I stay in a hotel when this is my home? I've come back to stay, permanently." A ripple of hushed whispers broke out among the influencers. Beatrice let out a dramatic, performative sigh, turning to her guests with a, "Can you believe this?" expression. "Oh, Eleanor, always so literal. You lived here as a child." "Yes, but you've been living in that little cottage in the north for decades. You don't belong in a place like this anymore. Look at you. You're shaking. You're confused." She stepped closer, her perfume cloying and sweet, like rotting fruit. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered, her voice dropping into a cold, hard tone. "I am the one who pays the taxes here. I am the one who keeps the roof from falling in. You are a guest at best. But today you are an embarrassment. My guests are some of the most powerful digital creators in Europe. They don't want to see a relic of the past haunting the gardens. Take your old car and go back to your cottage. I'll have someone send your things if there's anything worth saving." I felt the sting of her words, a sharp heat rising in my cheeks. It wasn't just the insult to my appearance. It was the utter dismissal of our history. This was the house where our mother had taught us to play the piano, where our father had sat in the library and told us stories of our ancestors who had defended this land. To Beatrice, it was just content. To her, I was just a relic. One of her friends, a young man with bleached hair and a camera rig, stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" "Bea, need us to call security to escort the lady out. It's ruining the aesthetic of the live stream." Beatrice laughed, a high, tinkling sound that felt like ice down my spine. "No, darling, she's just a bit lost. Age does that. You know, it makes you cling to things that aren't yours anymore." She turned back to me, her eyes dead. "Go, Eleanor. Before I have to do something we'll both regret. You're making a scene, and you know how much I hate scenes that aren't scripted." She turned her back on me then, dismissed me as if I were a piece of discarded trash, and went back to her champagne and her vision. I stood there for a long moment, the music thumping in my ears, the eyes of 100 strangers judging me for the dirt on my boots and the wrinkles on my face. They saw a poor, lonely old woman who had lost her way. They saw someone who was beneath them because I didn't have a blue checkmark next to my name or a designer label on my back. But as I turned to walk away, my hand brushed against the pocket of my old Barber jacket. Inside, my fingers curled around a heavy, tarnished silver key and a small, folded piece of parchment, the original trust deed of Oak Manor. They thought I was the one who was lost. They thought I was the one who was weak. But as I walked back to my old Volvo, I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Beatrice had forgotten one very important thing about our family. We are like the oak trees for which this manor was named. We grow slowly, we endure the storms in silence, and our roots go much, much deeper than anyone realizes. She wanted a show. Fine. I would give her a finale she would never forget. But for now, I would let her have her party. After all, the higher you build your house of cards, the more spectacular it looks when it finally begins to fall. As I sat in my car, watching the lights of the marquee flicker against the darkening sky, I pulled out my phone, an old model, but perfectly functional. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hello?" "Marcus," I said when the voice answered. "It's Eleanor. It's time to execute the heritage clause." "Yes, all of it. I want the forensic auditors at the gates by Monday morning." "And Marcus, tell the developers that the land is no longer for sale. In fact, tell them the owner has finally come home." I hung up the phone and looked at the manor one last time. The battle had begun, and Beatrice had no idea that she had already lost. I drove away slowly, the old Volvo's engine, a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the dark. The influencers were still dancing, the champagne was still flowing, and the insults were still fresh in my mind. But I slept well that night in the village inn. I slept with the peace of a woman who knows that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to wait. And my wait was almost over. Tomorrow, the world would see who really belonged at Oak Manor, and it wouldn't be the woman in the gold sequins. The night at the Lamb and Flag Inn was a restorative one. Though my heart remained heavy with the image of my sister's face, a mask of gold paint and shallow pride, the villagers, many of whom had gray hair matching my own, recognized me the moment I stepped into the pub's amber glow. They didn't see a relic or a smudge on the lens. They saw Eleanor of Oak Manor, the girl who used to climb the apple trees, and the woman who had quietly funded the village library for 3 decades without ever asking for a plaque. We sat in a corner booth, the scent of wood smoke and hops, providing a comfort that no 5-star hotel could ever replicate. They spoke in hushed, worried tones about the circus up on the hill. They told me how Beatrice had been charging the locals for access to the public footpaths that had been open for centuries. They told me how she had fired the head gardener, Mr. Henderson, after 40 years of service, because his limp didn't look good on her social media stories. Every word they spoke was a fresh ember on the fire of my resolve. It wasn't just my home she was destroying, it was the very fabric of our community's history. The next morning, the Cotswold mist clung to the ground like a shroud, but I rose early, dressed in the same waxed jacket and sturdy boots. I had work to do. I drove back to the manor just as the sun began to pierce through the gray, turning the limestone to a pale, ghostly gold. The Influencer Summit was moving into its second day, a VIP heritage brunch. According to the gaudy pink sign at the gate, this time, the security guard was different. A man with a tired face who recognized my car from the night before, but had clearly been given orders. "I'm sorry. Ma'am," he said, looking genuinely pained. "Mrs. Beatrice said that if you showed up, I was to direct you straight to the North Gate. She said your accommodations were prepared there." The North Gate led to the old gardener's cottage, a structure that hadn't been inhabited since the Great Frost of the 90s. It was a clear, calculated insult. I followed the overgrown track to the North Gate. The cottage was a ruin. Ivy had strangled the windows, and the roof sagged like the back of an old horse. It was damp, cold, and smelled of earth and neglect. Beatrice hadn't just denied me a room in the manor. She wanted to see me broken, living in the dirt, literally pushed to the margins of my own life. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my feet. There was a single iron bed frame and a crate of bottled water. On the crate sat a note in Beatrice's sprawling, aggressive handwriting. "Since you insist on being a part of heritage, I thought you'd appreciate the authenticity. Stay out of the main gardens today. We have a contract signing at 2:00 p.m. with the Neo Living Group. Don't ruin this for me. Eleanor. You always were the boring one. Let me be the one who actually makes something of this pile of rocks." I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't cry. At my age, tears are a luxury I save for beauty, not for the cruelty of small-minded people. Instead, I walked back toward the main house, taking the hidden path through the rhododendrons. I arrived at the south lawn just as the brunch was in full swing. The guests were seated at long tables draped in white linen, eating tiny portions of food and taking endless photos of their plates. Beatrice was at the head of the table, laughing with a man in a sharp, neon blue suit, the representative from Neo Living. No doubt, they were looking at architectural renderings on a tablet, glass towers, concrete wellness pods, and a helipad where the rose garden currently bloomed. They weren't breathing life into the estate. They were preparing to skin it alive and sell the pieces. As I approached the edge of the terrace, a young waiter, likely a local lad hired for the day, tripped over a loose stone. A tray of crystal flutes shattered on the patio, champagne soaking the hem of Beatrice's gold dress. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice didn't just get angry. She became a different person. The warm hostess vanished, replaced by a woman whose soul was as sharp as the broken glass. She screamed at the boy, calling him incompetent, peasant, and useless. The boy stood there, trembling, his face turning a deep, humiliated red. It was a display of such naked ugliness that even some of the influencers looked uncomfortable, though they didn't put down their cameras. They just adjusted their angles to catch the drama. "Beatrice." "That's enough," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the shrubbery. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of 70 years of authority. The guests turned, their eyes widening as they saw the village lady return. Beatrice spun around, her face contorted with rage. "You. I told you to stay at the cottage. Look at this. My dress is ruined. This event is ruined. And it's all because of the low-quality help you people produce in this god-forsaken valley." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "If you're so desperate to be here, Eleanor, then make yourself useful. Clean this up. Now, show these people what your heritage is actually good for. You've always been obsessed with this dirt. Get down on your knees and deal with it." A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. To ask your own sister to scrub the floor in front of guests was a bridge too far for even the most cynical observer. But I didn't flinch. I walked toward the mess, but I didn't look at the floor. I looked at the glass shards. They were baccarat, the set our grandfather had bought to celebrate the end of the war. "It's a shame," I said softly, picking up a jagged stem. "These were a gift to our grandmother. They survived the Blitz. Beatrice. It's a pity they couldn't survive your lack of grace." I turned to the young waiter, who was still shaking. "Go to the kitchen. Henry, tell Mrs. Higgins that Eleanor said you're to have a cup of tea and a break. I'll handle this." Beatrice let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You'll handle it. With what? Your social security check. You're a ghost. Eleanor, you're a shadow in a jacket that smells like wet dog. You think these people care about grandmother's glass. They care about the future. They care about Neo Living. By this evening, I'll have a signature that makes me the richest woman in this county. And you. You'll be lucky if I let you keep that shed." She turned to the man in the blue suit. "I apologize for the interruption. Mr. Vance." My sister has a bit of a mental fog. It comes with the age. Shall we continue with the tour of the North Wing? I've already planned where the nightclub will go. I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of my family's history, watching them walk away. The influencers followed like a flock of brightly colored birds, chirping into their microphones about toxic family dynamics and real-life Cinderella stories. I was alone on the terrace, a woman in an old coat with a handful of broken crystal. But as they disappeared into the house, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I saw a message from Marcus. Auditors arriving at 1:45 p.m. Security detail on standby. The trust documents have been verified by the High Court. Eleanor, you're in the clear. But are you sure you want to go through with the public disclosure? It will destroy her. I looked up at the manor, at the stone walls that had sheltered my ancestors through plagues and wars, through births and burials. I thought of the way Beatrice had looked at the waiter. I thought of the wellness pods replacing the roses. And I thought of the heritage clause my father had written into the trust deed, a clause that stated the manor could only be held by a steward who maintained the integrity and dignity of the lineage. If the steward brought shame upon the name, the title would revert instantly to the senior living member. Beatrice thought she owned the house because she paid the electricity bill. She had no idea that she was merely a tenant on probation, and her probation had just ended. I spent the next hour quietly moving through the house. I knew every secret passage, every loose floorboard, every hidden cupboard. I went to the library, the room Beatrice had intended to turn into a content studio. The shelves were empty, the leather-bound books piled in crates like discarded bricks. I found my father's old desk, pushed into a corner to make room for a ring light and a green screen. I sat in his chair, feeling the cool wood under my palms. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The storm was coming. Yes, but I was the one who had built the lighthouse. A guest wandered in, a man I hadn't noticed before. He was older than the others, perhaps in his 50s, with a refined air and a silver watch that spoke of quiet wealth. He looked at the crates of books and shook his head. A tragedy, he murmured, not seeing me at first. The first edition of The History of the Cotswolds, tossed aside for a camera. He finally noticed me in the corner. Oh, hello? You're the sister, aren't you? The one who… Well, I'm sorry for what happened on the terrace. It was quite uncalled for. I smiled at him. It's quite all right. People often mistake volume for power, don't they? He looked at me curiously, his eyes lingering on my face. You have your mother's eyes, he said suddenly. I'm Julian. My father was the family's solicitor before Marcus took over. I remember you, Eleanor. You were the one who saved the estate in '82 when the taxes nearly swallowed it whole. Why aren't you telling them? Why let her treat you like this? Because, Julian, I replied, standing up with a grace that made my old joints feel young again. Some lessons need to be felt to be learned. Beatrice has never known the value of anything, only the price. Today, she's going to learn the difference, and I'd prefer if the audience was as large as possible. She loves an audience. After all, Julian smiled, a slow, knowing grin. Then I shall make sure the neo-living representatives are all present for the final signing. I suspect the heritage clause is about to become very relevant. As I walked back out toward the lawn, the clock in the hallway struck 1:02 p.m. The tension in the air was palpable now, a static charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. The influencers were gathering for the grand reveal, their phones held high like torches. Beatrice was standing on the grand staircase, a gold pen in her hand, looking like a queen about to bestow a kingdom. She saw me standing at the back of the crowd, near the catering tents, and she gave me a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. She thought she was signing my eviction notice. She had no idea that every stroke of that pen was a nail in the coffin of her own vanity. I took a deep breath, the scent of the damp earth and the old stone filling my lungs. I felt the weight of the silver key in my pocket, and the phone in my hand buzzed with a final confirmation from Marcus. The auditors were at the gates, the police escort was in position, and for the first time in many years, I felt the full power of the name Eleanor. I wasn't just a sister, or an old woman, or a relic. I was the mistress of Oak Manor, and it was time to let the world know that some things, some people are simply not for sale. The rising storm was no longer a threat. It was my instrument of justice. And as the first drop of rain hit the terrace, I knew the performance was about to begin. I stepped forward, not as a victim, but as the judge. The crowd began to quiet as 3 black sedans pulled up the driveway, cutting through the line of Ferraris. Men in dark suits stepped out, carrying briefcases that looked like weapons of law. Beatrice's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her gold pen pausing over the parchment. She looked at me, then at the cars, then back at me. I didn't say a word. I just gave her a small, polite nod. The kind of nod a sovereign gives to a subject who has forgotten their place. The rising storm had arrived at the front door, and Beatrice was still holding a pen that no longer had any ink. The next hour would change everything. The influencers would get their viral moment, but it wouldn't be the one they expected. The neo-living group would find out that their investment was a legal minefield, and Beatrice would finally see the woman she had spent her life trying to overshadow. I watched her as she tried to regain her composure, her voice shrill as she asked the guards who these people were. I didn't answer, I just waited. After all, the best part of any story isn't the beginning or the middle. It's the moment when the mask falls off, and the world finally sees the truth. And the truth was about to be very loud indeed. I turned my gaze to the sky. The clouds. Now a deep, angry charcoal. The rain began to fall in earnest then, washing the gold paint from the statues and the dust from the grass. It was a cleansing rain, the kind that prepares the ground for something new to grow. I felt a strange sense of sorrow for my sister, then not for the loss of the house, but for the loss of her soul to the glitter and the greed. But mercy, as my father always said, must be earned. And Beatrice had spent her last coin of mercy on a ruined gold dress and a broken crystal glass. The climax was here. The stage was set, and I was finally ready to take my place at the center of it. The air in the great hall was thick, not just with the humidity of the gathering storm outside, but with the suffocating weight of pretense. You could almost taste the desperation in the room, a metallic, sharp tang that always accompanies the smell of easy money. Beatrice had moved the signing ceremony indoors to the library, the very heart of Oak Manor. She stood behind our father's mahogany desk, the gold pen gripped in her hand like a scepter. The influencers had crowded into the room, their ring lights casting a clinical, flickering glow over the centuries-old leather bindings of books they would never read. It was a circus, my friends, and the clowns were currently leading the parade. Mr. Vance, the man in the neon blue suit, looked like a shark that had just found a wounded whale. He nudged a thick stack of legal documents toward Beatrice, his smile never reaching his eyes. A historic day. Beatrice, he purred, his voice smooth and oily. With one stroke of this pen, we move Oak Manor from the dusty pages of history into the vibrant future of neo-living. A luxury wellness hub, a digital sanctuary, and, of course, your very generous payout. I stood at the back of the room, still in my damp waxed jacket, a stark contrast to the silks and sequins surrounding me. The young woman with the faux fur from earlier looked back and snickered, whispering to her friend about the ghost of the manor returning for one last scare. I didn't mind. In fact, I found it quite liberating. When people think you are nothing, they stop guarding their secrets. They show you exactly who they are. And what I saw in that room was a collection of people who knew the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. Beatrice cleared her throat, her eyes scanning the room for the best camera angle. Before I sign, she announced, her voice trembling with a mixture of greed and nerves. I want to make it clear that this isn't just about money. It's about evolution. Some members of my family, she paused, shooting a pointed, venomous look in my direction, would prefer to let this house rot into the ground. They cling to the past because they have no future. But I am a visionary. I am choosing progress. She lowered the pen to the paper. The cameras zoomed in. The influencers held their breath, ready to capture the moment they could tag as end of an era or new beginnings. But just as the gold nib touched the white parchment, the heavy oak doors of the library swung open with a resounding thud. It wasn't a dramatic gust of wind, but something far more powerful in this modern world. The arrival of the law. Marcus, my solicitor, stepped into the room. He was followed by 4 men in charcoal gray suits, each carrying a leather briefcase that looked more like an armored chest. Behind them were 2 uniformed officers of the High Court. The music from the hallway outside seemed to die an instant death. The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the rain lashing against the leaded glass windows. Beatrice froze, the pen hovering inches from her signature. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice rising an octave. This is a private event. Marcus, I told you I didn't need you here today. Mr. Vance has his own legal team. You're dismissed. Marcus didn't flinch. He had served our family for 40 years, and he had the stoic patience of a man who has seen every kind of human folly. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at the crowd with a weary, practiced gaze. Mrs. Beatrice, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. I am not here representing you. I am here representing the Oak Manor Heritage Trust, and I'm afraid this signing cannot proceed. Mr. Vance stood up, his face reddening. Now look here. I've spent millions on the due diligence for this acquisition. The title was cleared. Beatrice is the primary occupant and executor of her father's estate. Marcus offered a thin, pitying smile. She is the primary occupant. Mr. Vance, that is correct. But being an executor does not grant one the right to liquidate a trust-held asset without the consent of the senior trustee. He turned his eyes toward the back of the room, toward me. The influencers, sensing a shift in the narrative, began to turn their cameras away from Beatrice and toward the woman in the old jacket. I felt the heat of the lights on my face, but I didn't look away. I walked forward, the crowd parting from me like the Red Sea. I wasn't the relic anymore. I was the storm. What senior trustee? Beatrice shrieked, slamming her hand on the desk. Father left the house to me. He said I was the one who could keep it alive. I reached the front of the desk and looked my sister in the eye. No, Beatrice. Father said you could live here. He hoped you would learn to love it, but he knew your heart was as shallow as a puddle in July. That's why he didn't leave the house to you. He left it to a trust governed by the heritage clause. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded piece of parchment I had been carrying. I placed it on the desk, right on top of Mr. Vance's glossy neo-living contract. The clause states that if the resident member attempts to alter the structural integrity of the estate for commercial gain or brings disrepute upon the family name through unethical conduct, the trusteeship reverts immediately to the senior living descendant, which, as the birth certificates will show, is me. The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers. The influencers were frantically narrating to their phones, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing a real-life corporate and family execution. Beatrice's face went from red to a deathly, chalky white. It's a lie. That document is ancient. It's probably not even legal anymore. One of the men in the gray suits stepped forward. I am the lead forensic auditor from the High Court. Madam, we have spent the last 6 months reviewing the accounts of Oak Manor. Not only is the trust deed very much in effect, but we have also discovered that you have been using the estate's maintenance fund to finance your social media lifestyle. You've siphoned off nearly £2 million meant for the roof and the gardens to pay for private jets and designer clothes. Beatrice staggered back as if she had been physically struck. I was investing in the brand. The brand helps the house. I looked at her with a profound sense of sadness. The brand didn't pay Mr. Henderson's pension. Beatrice. The brand didn't fix the leaks in the East Wing. I did. The silence returned, deeper and colder than before. I turned to Mr. Vance, who was already starting to pack his things. And as for you, Mr. Vance, you might be interested to know that your company, Neo Living, is currently under investigation for predatory land acquisition. I know this because my investment firm is the majority shareholder of the bank that holds your construction loans. As of 10 minutes ago, those loans have been called in for immediate review. I don't think you'll be building any wellness pods here, or anywhere else, for that matter. The shark looked like he was about to drown. He looked at me, then at Marcus, then bolted from the room without saying another word. His legal team followed him like frightened pups. I turned back to Beatrice. She was leaning against the desk, the gold pen fallen to the floor. Forgotten, her audience, her powerful digital creators, were no longer looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with the predatory hunger of people who have found a fresh scandal to feast upon. One young man actually stepped closer, his camera inches from her face. How does it feel to be a fraud? B. Give us a comment for the live stream. Get out, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a jagged edge that made everyone in the room jump. I looked at the crowd of influencers. All of you. This is a private residence, not a film set. You have 10 minutes to gather your things and leave the property. If you are still here in 11 minutes, you will be escorted off by the police for trespassing. And if I see a single image of my home on your platforms tomorrow, Marcus will ensure your legal fees exceed your followers. You have never seen a group of powerful people move so fast. They scrambled for the doors, their silks rustling, their lights clattering against the floor. Within minutes, the great hall was empty of the noise, the greed, and the fake smiles. Only Beatrice remained. Standing in the middle of the room she had tried to sell, she looked small. For the first time in her life, the gold sequins looked cheap, like something you'd find at a carnival. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears of rage and humiliation. You think you've won. You think you can just come back here and be the lady of the manor. You're an old woman, Eleanor. You're irrelevant. Nobody cares about your heritage. I walked over to the window and looked out at the rain. I didn't do this to win. Beatrice, I did this to save. You were willing to tear the heart out of this house for a few years of fame. You treated the people who built this community like garbage. You treated me like a beggar in my own home. I turned back to her, my expression calm. The auditors are staying. They will be going through every receipt, every luxury purchase, every penny you stole from the trust. You will be held personally liable for the restoration of the maintenance fund. And as for the manor, you will be leaving tonight. Beatrice let out a choked sob. Tonight. It's raining. I have nowhere to go. You can't do this. I remembered the North Gate. I remembered the damp floorboards and the crate of bottled water she had left for me. I remembered the way she had told me to get on my knees and scrub the glass. "I believe you mentioned a hotel in the village," I said quietly. "I took the liberty of booking you a room. It's not 5 stars, but it's dry. And since you're so fond of authenticity, I've arranged for your belongings to be sent to that little cottage by the north gate. The one you thought was so charmingly heritage. You can stay there until the legal proceedings are finished. After all, you've always wanted to be part of the history of this place. Now you can experience it from the ground up." Beatrice fell into father's chair, her face buried in her hands. She wasn't the queen of the manor anymore. She was just a woman who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. I felt no joy in it, only a heavy sense of justice being served. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the music died away in the distance, and the real quiet of the country returned. I looked at Marcus, who gave me a solemn nod. "It's done, Eleanor," he said. "The house is yours, truly yours." I touched the wood of the desk, feeling the grain beneath my fingers. "No, Marcus," I replied. "I'm just the steward. The house belongs to the future. And for the first time in a long time, it finally has one." As the police led a sobbing Beatrice toward the door, I didn't watch her go. I looked at the pile of broken baccarat glass I had gathered earlier. It could be repaired. I thought, it would take time, and the cracks would always be there if you looked closely enough. But it could be made whole again, just like the manor, just like me. The sweet revenge people talk about isn't about hurting someone else. It's about the moment you realize they no longer have the power to hurt you. And as the rain washed the last of the influencer's footprints from the driveway, I knew that the real story of Oak Manor was only just beginning. The woman in the old coat was home, and the world would never make the mistake of underestimating her again. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet stone, crushed grass, and the sharp, ozone tang of a storm that had cleared the air. As the last of the black sedans and police cruisers disappeared down the long, winding driveway of Oak Manor, a profound silence settled over the estate. A silence that hadn't been felt here in years. It wasn't the empty silence of a tomb, but the peaceful, rhythmic breathing of a house that had finally been allowed to rest. I stood on the grand portico, watching the steam rise from the heated asphalt of the driveway. In the distance, I could see a lone yellow taxi navigating the puddles, carrying Beatrice away. She hadn't left with her designer luggage or her retinue of assistants. She had left with a single trunk of clothes and a face that looked 10 years older than it had that morning. The gold sequins on her dress had been replaced by a simple trench coat, and the arrogance in her eyes had been extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the law. Justice, my friends, is rarely a lightning bolt from the sky. More often, it is the slow, steady erosion of a lie until nothing but the truth remains. As I walked back into the great hall, I saw the staff, the real staff. The locals who had worked here for decades, emerging from the shadows where they had been hidden by Beatrice's modernization. There was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, whose family had served the manor since the Victorian era. There was Mr. Henderson, the gardener she had so cruelly dismissed, standing near the doorway with a look of quiet vindication on his weathered face. They didn't cheer, and they didn't gloat. They simply looked at me, and in their eyes, I saw a reflection of the dignity that this house was meant to represent. I nodded to them, a silent acknowledgement of our shared history. "Mrs. Higgins," I said, my voice echoing softly in the vast space. "I believe it's time we opened the windows. The house needs to breathe." The following weeks were a whirlwind of restoration, but of a different kind than Beatrice had envisioned. There were no neon lights, no camera crews, and certainly no wellness pods. Instead, there was the sound of hammers and saws as the roof was finally repaired using traditional Cotswold stone. There was the smell of beeswax and lemon oil as the library's oak shelves were polished back to their original luster. We didn't rebrand the manor. We remembered it. Every book that had been tossed into a crate was lovingly returned to its place. Every piece of broken crystal, including the baccarat set, was sent to a master artisan in London to be fused back together. The cracks remained, of course, but as I told Marcus one afternoon over tea, the cracks are where the light gets in. They are the scars of a battle won, and they make the object more precious, not less. Beatrice, meanwhile, was experiencing a very different kind of reality. True to my word, she was allowed to stay in the gardener's cottage by the north gate, the very place she had intended as my prison. The forensic auditors were relentless. They stripped away the layers of her influencer lifestyle, revealing a hollow shell built on debt and deception. Her social media accounts, once filled with images of private jets and five-star galas, became silent. Without the backdrop of the manor to provide a sense of borrowed prestige, her brand evaporated overnight. Her friends, the people who had sipped champagne while mocking an old woman in a wax jacket, were nowhere to be found. They had moved on to the next trend, the next scandal, leaving Beatrice to face the cold, damp walls of the cottage alone. I visited her only once. About a month after the unveiling, I didn't go to mock her. And I didn't go to seek an apology I knew she wasn't capable of giving. I went because she is my sister, and because the heritage clause wasn't just about protecting the house. It was about protecting the family. I found her sitting by a small coal fire, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it had seen better days. The cottage was small and cramped, but it was clean. For the first time in her life, Beatrice was living in a space that matched the size of her soul. She didn't look up when I entered. "Are you happy now, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice raspy and devoid of its usual performative trill. "You have your pile of rocks. You have your silent halls. You've destroyed everything I built." I pulled up a wooden chair and sat across from her. "You didn't build anything, Beatrice," I replied gently. "You decorated a stage, and when the play was over, you had nothing left but the costumes. I didn't take anything from you that was actually yours. I simply reclaimed what you were trying to destroy." She looked at me then, and for a fleeting second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the sister who used to hide behind my skirts when the thunderstorms rolled in. "I just wanted to be someone," she whispered. "I didn't want to be a relic like you." I smiled. A sad, knowing smile. Dignity isn't about being someone, Beatrice. It's about knowing who you are when nobody is watching. You spent so much time looking into a camera that you forgot how to look into a mirror? I left her a check not enough for a Ferrari, but enough to move into a modest apartment in the city and start a life that didn't require a filter. It was an act of mercy, not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let her bitterness dictate my character. As I walked back through the woods toward the manor, I realized that this was the true meaning of power. It wasn't about the ability to humiliate or exclude. It was the ability to remain steadfast in the face of cruelty and to offer grace when it was least expected. The world might value the flashy, the new, and the loud, but the earth belongs to those who are patient enough to wait for the storm to pass. By the time autumn arrived, Oak Manor had been transformed. The Influencer Summit was a distant, bad memory. The South Lawn was no longer a parking lot for supercars. It was a sea of amber and gold as the ancient oaks dropped their leaves. I hosted a dinner for the villagers, not a VIP heritage brunch, but a real meal with shepherd's pie, thick gravy, and local cider. Mr. Henderson sat at the head of the table, his limp a badge of honor for 40 years of service. We didn't take photos of our food. We didn't livestream our conversations. We simply sat together, shared stories of the harvest, and felt the warmth of the fire against the evening chill. It was the most relevant the house had felt in 50 years. You see, my friends, the mistake Beatrice made, and the mistake so many people make today, is believing that age and tradition are synonymous with weakness. They see a worn jacket and assume a lack of wealth. They see a wrinkled face and assume a lack of wit. They see a quiet life and assume a lack of ambition. But there is a silent sovereignty in the old ways. There is a strength in the things that cannot be bought, sold, or liked into existence. Character is a currency that never devalues, and integrity is a fortress that no amount of gold can breach. I may be an old woman in an old car, but I am the master of my own story, and my roots go deeper than any storm can reach. As the evening drew to a close and the last of the guests departed, I stood in the library one last time. I looked at the portrait of our father hanging above the mantel. In his eyes, I saw the same quiet resolve that had guided me through the last few months. He hadn't left me the manor because he loved me more than Beatrice. He left it to me because he knew I would be its shield. I reached out and touched the mahogany desk. Feeling the history of my family vibrating through the wood, the neo-living developers were gone, their glass towers nothing more than a discarded blueprint. The influencers had found new scandals to chase, and I was home. So, let this be a warning to those who think they can trample on the quiet and the humble. Never judge a person by the clothes they wear or the car they drive. You never know whose bank you might be standing in, or whose heritage you might be insulting. The world is full of ghosts like me, people who remember the value of a promise and the weight of a name. We are not relics to be discarded. We are the foundations upon which the world is built. And if you try to tear us down, you might just find that the house you're standing in is the one we own. I walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. A single star was visible through the clouds. A steady, unblinking light in the vastness of the night. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in the soft, natural glow of the moon. I didn't need a ring light to see the path forward. I had my memories, I had my integrity, and I had the keys to the castle. And that, my dear friends, is more than enough for anyone. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story has touched your heart, or perhaps reminded you of your own hidden strength, then my work here is done. Remember to hold your head high, keep your boots on the ground, and never, ever let someone else tell you what you're worth. The real power is always silent. Until we meet again, stay grounded, stay proud, and never forget who you are. If you enjoyed this journey and want to see more stories of justice, heritage, and the triumph of the underdog, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with those who appreciate the finer points of life. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories that truly matter. Until next time.